Okay, Kevin, you're back. Now let's move to the next item, the city manager's item. That would be consideration of Proposition 64, Adult Use of Marijuana Act.
Mr. Mayor, the council member McDonald and I represent the legislative committee, and we had a discussion about this some 2 to 3 weeks ago, and we have made a position, and I think there's someone here to talk about it.
Good evening, Your Honor, and members of the City Council.
Turn the mic on, Mike.
Oh, I'm sorry.
On November 8th, California voters will consider Proposition 64, which seeks to legalize and regulate marijuana for adults 21 years of age or older. Under the Act, individuals could possess limited amounts of marijuana and marijuana products and cultivate up to 6 marijuana plants indoors, such as in private residence, including an apartment, a mobile home, or other similar dwelling. With regard to commercial, let me move back to that. However, if they are going to cultivate plants indoors, they must be within an fully enclosed area, secured, and not visible from a public place. With regard to commercial marijuana businesses, the measure establishes a statewide comprehensive regulatory framework that is very similar to the medical marijuana industry, created by the Medical Cannabis Regulation and Safety Act, which was passed into law last year. Under the Act, the Bureau of Marijuana Control will oversee both medical and recreational marijuana industries, including licensing. Additionally, under the Act, marijuana cultivators, manufacturers, distributors, retailers, and testing laboratories will need to obtain a state license to operate. However, state licensing authorities, which include the Departments of Food and Agriculture, Public Health, and Consumer Affairs, may not issue a state license if approval of such license will violate provisions of any local ordinance or regulation. In terms of local control, there will be no state preemption of local ordinance under this measure. The measure thereby protects local authority over marijuana land uses, but as I indicated earlier, it restricts local agencies from completely prohibiting private indoor marijuana cultivation. However, local agencies could consider adopting ordinances to regulate indoor cultivation for public health and safety reasons, such as nuisance odors and fire inspections. A local agency could also require indoor cultivators to obtain a landlord's consent, if applicable. If Proposition 64 passes by a simple majority vote of the people of California, smoking of marijuana will become legal, but it will still be prohibited in places where smoking tobacco is prohibited under the city's existing ordinances. As for taxation, the measure imposes new state taxes on cultivation and sale of medical and recreational marijuana. The new tax would be based on a dollar amount per ounce, and the new excise tax would be based on the retail price of marijuana products sold, which, according to the Legislative Analyst Office, could yield revenue over $1 billion annually. Most of the funds would be required to be spent on for specific purposes such as youth programs, environmental protection, and law enforcement. And as Councilmember Little indicated just before I began my report, on August 30th, the Legislative Committee completed a review of this measure and discussed the potential impacts to the city and its residents. Based on the committee's review and discussion, there are many unknowns and a climate of legal uncertainty that remain, including the fact that marijuana is illegal under law. And for these reasons, the Legislative Committee recommends the City Council oppose Proposition 64. Should the City Council oppose the committee's recommendation, the City Council will be taking a position against cultivation, possession, and use of marijuana for recreational purposes. On behalf of the Legislative Committee's recommendation, The suggested action is for a motion to oppose Proposition 64, the Adult Use of Marijuana Act. This concludes staff's report. I'm available to answer questions.
You want to go?
Bill, go ahead, Bill.
No,
I just,
Questions?
for one clarification, this takes effect immediately if it passes. It's not one that waits till the next year, right?
It would go into effect November 9th.
The 9th, okay.
Other questions, Kevin?
Yeah, maybe the committee members can answer this, but perhaps Roger or even Don. But was there any discussion about the impacts on law enforcement if this does pass?
Yeah, if I could perhaps talk a little bit about what the committee discussed and everything, and that was certainly one of the biggest discussions points. We talked about what's going on in Colorado, which most of it isn't all that good. Driving under the influence of marijuana, which is almost impossible to prove, and given the fact that marijuana wears off quickly. So by the time you get someone that you think is driving marijuana, get them to a place where you could test them, in many cases they walk because the marijuana is out of their system. But they've had about a 20% increase in arrests for impaired driving because of marijuana. There's an increase in hospital intakes because of overdosing. And one of the big problems is this indoor cultivation, because it says 6 plants, but how are you going to, and you don't have to have a license or anything, how are you going to check, number one, who's doing it, number two, how many plants they have, and whether they, and so you could have a lot of marijuana growing in mushy, drier utility rooms and so forth. So it's going to be a problem for the police department. And oh, by the way, in Colorado, there's a big intake of marijuana issues at schools, high school particularly. So for those reasons, we thought it was just something that we're not going to be, even if we take a position of no position on this and it passes, and we do everything we want to under that by not allowing it in except for the cultivation, we are going to be impacted simply because we don't live in a bubble. And what happens in the uses in other places, the sale of marijuana and so forth, is going to infect Camarillo. So we felt that it was a citywide issue and that we shouldn't get ourselves into that unless it just happens. That's why we took the position.
Thank you.
Who's the other committee member?
It was me. One of the things we talked about was the fact that often we don't take positions on propositions as they come before the citizens, but why this one? Because it has such a direct effect on the city, on the operation of the city, on our police department. So we felt it was something that we really should bring forward and see if the rest of the council would agree to take a position on it. We felt that while our smoking laws covered it, as far as smoking in public, there was just so much more involved on other people's rights when you begin to allow this kind of thing. And so it is something that we felt very strongly about, that it's just not in the best interest of our communities. So for those reasons, we felt that it was important for us to take a stand on it.
Kevin, anything?
I had asked the question about law enforcement
What
and
about-
the impacts on law enforcement.
Absolutely, and they're going to have to deal with how, if it passes, how they're going to monitor all of this, which Mr. Little talked about. How do you find out how much they're growing? How do you measure that? Even when you pull someone over for impaired driving, it's a lot more difficult to tell if they're under the influence of marijuana versus alcohol. So the testing and how they're going to handle that, and I don't know if our captain wants to add to that discussion. He probably knows more about it than I do, but it's certainly going to make it more difficult for them to patrol our streets and to maintain that safe environment that we all want. Am I? I'm watching him shake his head.
Now, we're through with questions now. Any comments before we go?
You got one more.
Bill?
Again, in Colorado, they've found that there is still as much marijuana being going on underground because all they've done is driven the price down, which makes more people anxious to buy it. So all that's done is to undercut the official price of whatever the state is charging, and then just driven it underground further.
And the other interesting thing in Colorado is that since it is now legal to grow it there, they're exporting it too. So it's become big business for them and not necessarily in a good way. So there's just a lot of reasons to. We felt
What
it was
other
important.
states have approved them? Is Colorado, is there a couple, Oregon? Is there another one? Anybody? Is it just two?
Washington.
In Washington, yeah, Washington's the other. There's 3.
Okay.
Alaska does?
Alaska does? I didn't know about
Yeah,
that.
Alaska. Well, they have long winters. They say.
Yeah.
They got to make it through the winter somehow. Well, I got a couple, 3 comments, since this was the area I lived in for 27 and a half years. And living with those who had these problems, not only federal cases, but also county cases for 4.5 years, I'd like to talk about a few of these things that I'm very much against it. I always have been. Federal law preempts it. If it's a big enough case, it should go feds anyway. This way, we don't have to worry about it. But that doesn't take care for all the people using it out here in the community. I don't think that you understand. We have a group here that gets a grant from the federal government under Rabbi Lang that the police department goes to those meetings too, and so do I sometime. And it's showing the different things and ways. Marijuana is not just marijuana anymore. They add other things to it. It's much more potent, much more potent. And then don't tell me you can't get in a car and drive and be under a real potent bunch of marijuana. I can guarantee you, you'll be driving under the influence. Some of these cases, many of these cases where they're growing things, and you read in the paper occasionally, and you go in the mountains and they find this whole setup with irrigation and everything. Well, some of these things are tied to cartels in Mexico. If you don't think they haven't moved into Colorado, wrong. They know where to make money. And if they can go there and get less of a headache, then that's where they're going to go. Again, children will have a greater access to marijuana now if this happens. I'm worried about the youth and what they can get into and get it easier. An adult can buy it for them right then and there. The youth programs, it talked about this spending in youth programs and police, and yeah, who does that? Is that in their budget? The state of California put that in their budget that way? Or they just use what they want to and they say you're going to go to youth? I'd like to see some of that because I know how they operate up there. Marijuana, again, I told you, is much more powerful. And the sales, we mentioned the sales in Colorado. Many, and they've had articles on it, many are going out of state with truckloads and carloads of stuff to sell other places because they can get it easier there and not have to worry about growing it. Someone else is growing it and they're taking it. I think there's a lot of bad things that come out of this legalization of marijuana in California. We have much more populated areas than Washington and Oregon. We have a whole lot of people in Los Angeles that get impacted by this too. And again, when you're testing people for marijuana, yes, immediately. But if you smell it on, you'll know they've been using marijuana. But the other thing is, they don't pass a alcohol test because they can't. They don't have alcohol in their system. So it's got to be a illegal substance that they've got in them. And so they will then take them in, and you can get it from a blood test. And if you think it's going to disappear, no, marijuana stays in your hair. That's how we used to test them. Take a piece of hair. You'll have marijuana in that hair. Not from out here, but from inside. And so you can pick them up through their hair samples also. Anyway, I've spoken enough about this, but I'm very much against this being legalized, and I'll make that clear, I always have. Because I've seen the results. It starts out with marijuana that goes to something else. And this marijuana is much more potent than it used to be. Okay.
Can I add one more thing? And you mentioned, and it was one of the other reasons why the committee thought that this needs to come forward for the council to take a position on. It is indeed against federal law, and we felt that that was very important because we are here to abide by federal law. Sometimes, whether we like it or not, that is what we're here to do, and we take that oath of office to do so. So that was another primary reason why we felt it was important that the council take an action on it.
I used to tell people that as a federal officer, folks, You can't just do it, oh, we'll move to Washington. Yeah? And the feds are up there too, and it's still illegal. If you've got big enough amount of marijuana, the feds could get into it. Anyway, that's done.
Your Honor,
Yes.
I'll make a motion that we oppose Proposition 64, Adult Use of Marijuana Act.
I'll second that.
We have a motion and a second. Any other comments? Please vote. I'm sure that'll pass 5 to zip, but she's not here right now. It's 4 to nothing with Ms. Craven still out. She'll be back soon. Okay, let's move on.